welcome. So I just wanted to take some moment to introduce our next presenter. She's going to be speaking about accessibility through legislation project. And Krissi Spinoza is Acting Director, Accessibility Secretariat and Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction. So welcome so much, and I can see your face on the screen. Hello. And Sharito is just going to be bringing up the presentation in a second here.
Wonderful. Okay, well, can everyone hear me all right? Is that yep, my sound is working great. I'm getting nods from Anita. That's fantastic. So thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And I really couldn't have asked for two better speakers to introduce the topic of accessibility legislation consultation. So what a wonderful agenda to speak on today. Just while the presentation is being pulled together, I am going to have to leave, I'm afraid, at 2:30 today. So I'm going to whiz through these slides. I also heard a lot of familiar names on the call today, so wonderful that I've spoken to some folks. I apologize to those of you who've heard this presentation a million times before. I have been running it around the province for the last 3 months, so I'm really sorry to anyone who's heard it before. Hopefully there's some new pieces in there that you get to enjoy today. How's the presentation looking? Are you able to pull it up?
Krissi, I've sent you an organization, a request to be a presenter. Do you see that on your screen? Oh, there we go.
There we go. Great.
I can also show it from here if you prefer.
It is saying that it has paused.
Okay, here, let me. No problem. Let me try again.
And my computer is now flashing bright red at me. That's always really exciting.
Oh, okay. We've angered it. How about, would you like me to show it from here, Krissi, and then
sure, if you want to do that, that would be great. Thank you so much. Oh. All right. How's that working?
Sorry, it just takes a second to do it.
Sorry, folks.
Okay, should see it any second.
Great, wonderful. So I see it. So thank you to everyone on the line. If you want to just flick through onto the overview of accessibility legislation, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to do a quick overview today of a document that we have been touring around the province for the last 3 months that provides a sort of outline of what accessibility legislation might look like in British Columbia. So I'm going to provide a wee bit of context for accessibility legislation, a quick overview of what legislation might look like, and a summary of the engagement processes we've been using, which I think will tie quite nicely back into Claire's presentation from earlier around that beautiful engagement continuum. That's fantastic. So in terms of accessibility legislation, when we're talking about that work from a provincial perspective, what we're really talking about is being able to empower organizations to identify, remove, and prevent accessibility barriers. And it's really building on a lot of work that already exists in terms of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, UNDRIP, and then also building on accessibility legislation from other provinces and federal accessibility legislation. So we have a lot of models of work that really has worked for other places and ways of approaching this work. BC's been able to sort of build on that in creating its idea about what accessibility legislation might look like. Because this is quite a lengthy process, it isn't like flicking a switch and suddenly everything becomes accessible. And there's so many different partners and stakeholders involved. One of the pieces that we really felt was important was to have some principles that would guide both the engagement process, the development of legislation, and the implementation of legislation beyond. And so you can see those principles outlined in the accessibility legislation slide. And as part of this engagement process, one of the questions we ask people is, have we got it right with these principles? What else needs to be there to make sure that we're really living the values of people with disabilities and that we're able to respond in a way, and that everyone working on this project is able to respond in a way that's appropriate. So if we can flick on to the next slide, that would be lovely. So I have mentioned that we have been doing quite a lot of consultation and engagement over the last 3 months, but there was a lot of work that went on prior to us going out to the public. One of those things was just look at where provincial government's already been touching base and already been speaking with people, and trying to make sure that we weren't repeating those conversations. I think Claire mentioned trust and the importance of trust in having conversations, just generally in terms of consultation. And one of the pieces we wanted to do was to make sure that we weren't really letting people down and sort of spoiling the conversation before it started by not knowing and listening to things they'd already told people. So we started that process by talking to folks who'd done the poverty reduction consultation, folks who'd done disability consultation back in 2013 in the province, and then folks who'd done sort of more recent consultations around federal accessibility legislation. And we also did a bit of pre-engagement work, engaging stakeholders and partners in this work and asking them if they could take on some responsibility for doing some peer-to-peer engagement. Sometimes it's easier to tell peers what it is that you're thinking about. So for example, we engaged the President's Group, which is a group of businesses interested in accessibility and inclusion, to go out to the business sector. We engaged Not So Much Tribal Council to really go out and talk with Indigenous stakeholders and rights holders in this area to ensure that we were engaging with them in a respectful way. So making sure that we were engaging with a wide variety of people. The formal engagement process has now closed, but the conversations continue, and this is, one of the conversations. So please feel free to, if anything comes to you during this process, please feel free to email me or have a discussion with me about how you can get involved. And the conversations are going to continue while legislation is drafted, and while we begin to establish the structures and develop standards, and all of that is going to make sense in just a few minutes' time. So if we can move the slide on, that would be great. So in terms of what accessibility legislation could look like in British Columbia, we've quite specifically described it as accessibility legislation, rather than disability legislation. And that's because we believe creating an inclusive province really benefits so many folks. So it can benefit the parent with a stroller to have a dropped curb, just as it can benefit somebody with mobility challenges. It can be incredibly advantageous to someone whose first language maybe isn't English to have written announcements on transit as well as verbal announcements, just as it can be for someone who is deaf or hard of hearing. So we really wanted to approach this with quite a broad understanding of accessibility, and we wanted an inclusive definition of disability. And if you look in the framework document that I showed off earlier, it's on page 17, the sort of ideas that we're playing with in terms of that definition of disability. And they're building on global definitions of disability and federal definitions of disability that look at it as barriers that society erects. So looking at how we can remove those barriers society erects for people. This is enabling legislation, much like poverty reduction legislation. So it's conceived of as legislation that outlines objectives. It starts at the development and implementation of standards, and it outlines how those standards will be developed. And it also outlines how the authorities and the tools to achieve those objectives will be developed, and designates responsible organizations for their development. So it really sets in process a way of going about creating a more accessible province. It doesn't immediately legislate overnight that, all curbs need to be dropped or anything like that. It says, here's who needs to be involved, and here's how we're going to become more accessible, and here's the kind of conversations they need to have, and here's some of the tools that are available to them, and it allows them to get on with that process. So if we can just move on to the next slide. So I think one of the key tools that the legislation will outline is the process for developing accessibility standards. And so these are standards that do say how things should be done, and those standards will be developed collaboratively. And one of the questions we were asking people throughout the engagement process is, are you rather those standards were developed quicker, but with maybe fewer people involved in the development of them? Would you rather that it took longer but more people were involved in the development of those standards and there was more opportunity for conversation around those standards? So I'm looking forward to really parsing the data and determining what it is that people said there. The sort of areas that we considered developing accessibility standards in were service delivery, employment, built environment, information and communication, and transportation. And one of the areas that we really wanted to hear about in the engagement process is, are there other areas for the development of these standards? What are they? And how do we define those areas? And to make sure that we can begin to get an idea from the public of what sort of approaches they wanted to take to the development of standards and what sort of areas they wanted to develop those standards in, and get a really good idea of the development of those standards. If we can just move on to the next slide, that'd be great. Thank you so much. We know that just developing standards, just writing legislation is never enough. You have to really think about the how of implementation. And so we really wanted to consult with the public here and engage the public on different approaches to how things can be implemented. So we wanted to hear from them about timelines and different approaches to timelines, both for the implementation and for the review of accessibility legislation. So balancing that idea of you want to review often enough in order to make it accountable, but not so often that you haven't had time to do anything since the last review, and trying to balance those two ideas. We also wanted to ask them about how we should go about developing, implementing, and reviewing the accessibility standards, having those conversations. And we wanted to ask about governance and different approaches to governance for accessibility legislation. So who needs to be involved in making sure that these things happen? And accountability, which is the next slide, was a really vital piece of that. So if we can just move on to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So accountability was another area that I think we had lots of different ideas on in this consultation process, and it's been really interesting to hear people's thoughts about how to ensure things are accountable. So we asked people how to make sure that the implementation process was a success and how we could go about that. And sometimes that was phrased in a quite high level, kind of strategic way, and sometimes it was phrased as like, is it more stick or more carrot? And having those kind of conversations with people around the table. So we got all sorts of different ideas. We proposed ideas and we got all sorts of different ideas about how to ensure compliance was in place. So there was sort of some ideas around accessibility plans and progress reports, but balancing the need to make sure that they are not too onerous and that people are not caught up in reporting rather than doing. We talked to folks and we really heard from people about the need to provide an easy and central point of contact so that people who are looking to make accessibility changes could do so by simply phoning a single number or emailing a single place, and that person would take care of it rather than referring them to other organizations or other places. We talked a lot about and heard a lot about community hubs and different ideas for training and education and awareness, different tools and resources that would be super helpful. We also heard from people more about that stick piece and different ideas that people had. So inspections, mediation, fines, all those kind of pieces to just try and make sure that that the standards where they were mandatory would be actually implemented. And if we can move on, that would be great. And we heard very strongly, I think, during this whole process about the importance of creating incentives and making sure that people were encouraged and that best practice was promoted, and that was a really strong thing that a lot of people felt would lead to a culture of inclusion. So we heard a lot about tax incentives, about funding programs, about reducing reporting requirements for those who are already showing leadership in this area, and for recognizing that leadership and sharing and spreading best practice around. So lots of fantastic suggestions there for incentives. And then if we just move on, that would be great. So all of these different ideas were contained in this document, which is still available, and if anybody would like one, please just let me know. So it's the British Columbia Framework for Accessibility Legislation, and it outlines different ideas, and then it also quite clearly outlines some questions. So for example, on the principles page, it provides a little area where people could answer some questions. And we did that to make sure that we knew and we were really clear within ourselves, okay, what is up for discussion and what are the lawyers going to say needs to be in legislation, and there's no ability to have a discussion about that. Where are we providing information? Where are we wanting to educate and consult? And where are we really able to engage? And so we wanted to make sure that our engagement process really reflected those different aspects and the different parts of the continuum. That document, the framework itself, was available in ASL and then 6 other languages as well. We also had an accessible Word version and an accessible PDF that worked with screen readers. We had a DAISY version up on the website, so an audio version, and we had a contracted and uncontracted Braille, and probably the piece of learning that stayed with me the most, because we still have a lot of those copies left, is don't bother getting uncontracted Braille. It just takes up a lot of space and nobody seems to read it. So contracted Braille, definitely the way to go. If we can move on, that would be great. We tried to offer a really wide range of feedback opportunities. So we had over 500 people attend 10 different regional community meetings. We had over 6,000 folks fill out an online questionnaire. About 60 people came along to a virtual town hall. We had emails and ASL videos that folks could send to us. We also encouraged people to call and leave a phone message. And then we had some of this peer-to-peer discussion and conversation. So we provided small grants of up to about $2,000 to different organizations to host independent community conversations throughout the province. So that might be a local CNIB office having a conversation and maybe paying for everybody's cab to get there that day. It might be a First Nation who wanted to have a conversation about what it would look like in their nation. It could be we had a chamber who wanted to hold a meeting, and so they were able to offer pizza to people who came along. So there was all sorts of different ways that people could have these conversations. We also had roundtable meetings with a range of different organizations. And we have received formal submissions from over 50 organizations and many, many more from individuals, which we're just going through at the moment. We're currently sort of swimming out of our data hole, and we will be putting it all up on the website as soon as we've analyzed it. So lots of opportunities for people to provide feedback and lots of discussion. I am open to questions, and then if we go on to the next slide, I also have some questions that I would love to hear from people. I'm not sure we have time today to cover them all, but is there anything there that immediately leaps out to folks as something they would like to ask a question about, or something that they would like to respond to in terms of those questions?
Great, thank you for your presentation. That was wonderful.